Hi everybody. I know I'm a little bit behind on my recordings, um, but where we last left off, we were talking about the French Revolution. We had talked a little bit about how the Third Estate was dissatisfied, right? Happy people do not overthrow governments. And we talked about some of the causes of the French Revolution and the events leading into it. Especially in relation to those four Enlightenment ideals that we focus upon in this class: consent of the governed, natural rights, rule of law, and social contract theory. So picking up where we left off, right, the king had been overthrown and the Third Estate had taken control of the French government. So let's take a quick look at some of those revolutionary results. So what ends up happening is the monarchy becomes limited. The monarchy is no longer judge, jury, and executioner. The king ends up becoming limited to enforcing the laws, right? Like the executive branches for the United States today, the executive branch enforces the laws and implements the laws. So the king is limited to enforcing the laws. And the laws are being written by the new legislative assembly. So this is akin to our legislature. So the legislative assembly is writing the laws. They're taking matters into their own hands with regards to rule of law. And liberté, égalité, fraternité becomes the slogan of the assembly. So if you take a look at what liberty means freedom. Equality, that one's pretty obvious. Fraternity is brotherhood. And that is kind of a key hint as to what's going to come for with regards to Enlightenment thought in France, because there are certain people who are being left out of these Enlightenment thoughts, right? So remember, it's not like nobody ever knew what natural rights were before this. Of course, people have an idea of their rights. Of course, people have an idea of they shouldn't be, abused by others, that they shouldn't be, taken advantage of by the more powerful. What the Enlightenment does is give a kind of common framework and way of speaking for a lot of the world around these ideas, right? So this liberty, equality, fraternity, it really is seen in the American Revolution. It's really seen in the French Revolution, but you always kind of have to ask, like, are these ideas being applied to everybody? Who is being left out? In France, they create the Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen, but the idea of it being the rights of man is going to be very much challenged by the women of France, who feel very left out, okay? And there's also going to be a state-controlled church. So now you have the third estate actively controlling the first and second estates and very much limiting their power. So anytime, you have some sort of revolution, some sort of change that goes on, it's not like everybody all agrees on the same everything. There's usually different stages and different factions that are in play. So within the third estate, you have different parts of it. They were not necessarily some unified force. You have radicals. Radicals want sweeping changes to the system. The radicals went complete upheaval, wipe the slate clean, and let's try to make everything anew. Moderates want some changes, but they don't want total upheaval. They just want some significant changes to the system. And conservatives are just looking to tweak the system that was already there. So if you take the same idea, you could talk about, police reform here in the United States kind of having the same sort of divisions, or the same kind of different perspectives and outlooks and goals with regards to police reform, which was big in the news, in this year in 2020. So radicals want sweeping changes. That's the defund the police, take money away from police departments and take away the things that, perhaps the police shouldn't be handling, like, mental health issues and those sorts of things. Moderates want some changes, but not total upheaval. So moderates might want funding, some funding changes, or for the funding to be shifted. Instead of spending so much money on, weaponry, maybe we spend money on sensitivity training or on culturally responsive training for police officers, or how to deal with people in a mental health crisis in a way that does not escalate, right? And conservatives would be looking for very few changes. Conservatives would be people who just want to see a couple of little changes like banning chokeholds and that sort of stuff. So you always have this kind of, grayscale of possibilities, even within revolution. Okay, so mob actions end up taking place, right? And you have the struggle between the different divisions in France. And the Jacobins, who are the radical group that executes the king, end up taking over. Now, the Jacobins also engage in very questionable practices. So even though the French Revolution was about the Third Estate acquiring power and putting the ideas of the Enlightenment into practice, the Jacobins themselves are going to violate these ideals, okay? And their rationale is, man, things are crazy. We need to, just consolidate our power and make sure we have a good hold on what's going on in France, so that way we can make our ideas workable. And so the Jacobins end up trying to wipe out any sort of opposition. So those that would criticize what the Jacobins were doing, those who were, pro-monarchy, or people who said, you know what, yeah, it was pretty bad under King Louis, but there was this one thing that wasn't so bad that, that he did. You could be reported to the Jacobins. So during the Reign of Terror, right? Reign is to rule. So the Jacobins were ruling with terror through the populace in France. And so people became very fearful to speak their mind. So people were afraid to engage in their natural rights of free speech. We talked about social contract theory, meaning the states are supposed to provide, and the government's supposed to provide safety and security. And in exchange, the people follow the rules. Well, if you take a look at social contract theory and the Jacobins are not providing safety and security. People are afraid. People are afraid to say anything against them. And if you are afraid, you are not secure. You are not secure if you can be grabbed by your government and executed with the smallest farce of a trial. Okay. So thousands end up being accused of being enemies, and they end up getting executed and having their heads chopped off. And what eventually ends up happening is you have a group of individuals who realize that what the Jacobins are bringing are greater chaos. There is no safety and security. And even though, the rights were not what anybody wanted under King Louis XVI, what's going on underneath the Jacobins is easily, arguably, as damaging as what was happening underneath the king's rule. So the Jacobins are removed from power. Their leader, Robespierre, ends up having his own head chopped off. And then eventually Napoleon rises to power. Now, one of the mistakes that people make is this idea that Napoleon overthrew the Jacobins. That is not true. What you have is a power vacuum. What you have is not really much in the way of leadership in France. And Napoleon sees that once the Jacobins are removed, that he has an opportunity to kind of slip in and take over. And that's what he does. So Napoleon rises through the military. He ends up taking over control of France, and he ends up establishing a dictatorship. So the Jacobins lost the trust of the people. And when the Jacobins lost the trust of the people by not making things safe or secure, they ended up, losing control of the country. And Napoleon is very mindful of this. He doesn't want to lose the people's trust. He knows what the biggest concerns are for the people of France. So Napoleon ends up using the military to take control. And he starts changing some rules. He knows that one of the fundamental complaints of the French people is that tax collection was not equal, was not fair, that the third estate was paying disproportionately more taxes than the very, very wealthy, something that should sound familiar in today's day and age. So Napoleon makes tax collection more equal, more fair, right? He, uses rule of law to make sure that things are written down. He makes sure consequences are written down, and he's trying to make sure that things are applied more equally, right? Napoleon starts public education in France, gives churches back some of their power, because there are some good things that the church did for the populace of France, especially the poor. And Napoleon writes a new set of laws that makes things more equal. That is rule of law right there, the Napoleonic Code. So when you have a code, there are a set of rules, right? Some people have personal codes of conduct. That is a set of rules, a set of structure that guides your behavior. Napoleon, however, ends up making a very large mistake when he decides to look outward beyond France. And so he makes, there are three kind of key, most important mistakes that he makes. One of them is the continental system. Napoleon, I'm going to stop sharing for a minute so I can set something up. Napoleon ends up trying to blockade Great Britain. And this is a problem because Great Britain is an island nation, and they are known for how good their navy is. If you're going to go after a nation that has an exceptionally good navy, you better make sure that yours is even better. And that did not fundamentally happen. France and Great Britain have a long history of conflict, hundreds and hundreds of years of conflict. So you can see Great Britain's not a humongous nation, but it is an island nation, and they are very well known for their navy. So this is something that is basically a fight that Napoleon should not have taken on. It's ineffective. The blockade angers Britain, right? A blockade is when you block things from coming in or going out. It messes up the trade of Great Britain. And if you really want to tick someone off, mess with their money, right? The British Navy is clearly better than the French, so this does not work. Going back to our map, Napoleon also decides that he wants to declare war on Portugal. Now, if you look, there's a nation that's in between France and Portugal, and that's Spain. And Napoleon doesn't just, send his troops via boat. Remember, his navy is also tied up with this mess in Great Britain. Napoleon ends up marching his troops to Portugal. But in order to march his troops to Portugal, he has to go through the nation of Spain. And as you might expect, Spain has something to say about that. If Canada declared war on Mexico, or Mexico declared war on Canada, one or the other wanted to march their armies through America, through the United States, in order to get to the other, we of course would object. Nobody wants foreign armies on their own soil. And so the Spanish object to Napoleon marching through. Napoleon's response is to depose the monarchs, right? Take the throne away from them and give the throne to his brother Joseph. This is a violation of consent of the governed, right? So if you are in Spain, the governed are the Spanish people. And the Spanish people did not give permission to Napoleon to change their rulers. So now Napoleon is yes, trying to expand the influence of these Enlightenment ideals, but he's also falling into the same trap as the Jacobins, in which he is violating these Enlightenment ideals in order to achieve his own goals. Okay? And much like how it didn't work out for the Jacobins, that is not going to work out for Napoleon either. The biggest mistake that Napoleon engages in is the invasion of Russia. Now, one of the truisms of history is just don't invade Russia. Just don't. It never works out. It always works out terribly. Okay. Russia is an extremely brutal country from a geography point of view, right? And it's profoundly cold, and it's dangerously, wickedly cold. We're not talking about, it got a little cold once or twice in winter here in New York City. We are talking dangerous. You will freeze within minutes. So Napoleon has his army march all the way across Europe into Russia. And as Napoleon is marching across into Russia, he's taking his army and he's spreading the Enlightenment ideas as he goes to his army goes to Russia. And the people of these other countries see this. They see the French army being led by, their general slash emperor. People of the nations of Europe see how strong France is, and they were able to do it without a king and a queen. And, they are the living example of the Enlightenment. And that sends a very dangerous message within these kingdoms. The kings and queens do not like Napoleon marching about Europe because the people of France chopped off the heads of their relatives, right? The kings and queens and emperors of these other nations were the family of King Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette. So this is personal, right? And this undermines the rule of those kings and queens, because this army is walking around as a living example of you don't need monarchs, right? And that's very threatening to the monarchs of Europe. Now, Napoleon marches all the way across Europe into Russia. And the Russians are very smart. The Russians do not engage with Napoleon head on. And the Russians are known to be absolutely cruel, C-R-U-E-L, mean, horrific rulers to the peasantry in Russia. The peasantry is treated horribly by the Russian rulers. And so the Russian czars, they just let the people suffer. So as Napoleon advances his army, the Russians kind of drop back. And Napoleon advances more, and the Russians drop back some more. But as the Russians are retreating from Napoleon, they are taking all of the supplies. They are taking all of the food they can. They are taking every resource. So that way the French army can't strengthen themselves as they go. So the French army ends up slowly losing out on supplies, not having the food that it needs to take care of its armies. And the Russians are just torching everything behind them, and they're leaving their own peasants to suffer. The Russian leaders don't care. Their end game is win. And if they have to make sacrifices within their own country to do that, okay, they're all right with that. And as Napoleon is advancing and his army is becoming more tired, weaker, the seasons are advancing, and winter is approaching. Winter in Russia is brutal. And so the Russians set up this situation where the French army is really suffering, and the French army is sick and malnourished and not doing well. And when do you attack your enemy? You attack your enemies when they're weak. And so the Russians wait until that French army is already on the verge of collapse and then attack. Okay. And of course, the Russians are able to defeat the French. So even though Napoleon kind of ascribes to this idea, believes in this idea of militarism, depending upon a military solution for problems instead of diplomacy, that really kind of becomes his undoing at the end. So he prepared for militarism, developing the armies. He becomes aggressive with other countries. He has very strict social controls of France, right? And the people of France are willing to go along with it when he is embodying the ideas of the Enlightenment. But when those ideas start to fail, when he starts to grow beyond France and endanger the stability of France by going after these other nations, that is when, you know, it endangers the rule of Napoleon, and he ends up not being the ruler of France for much longer. Okay, and that is where we're going to stop it for today. Again, if you have any questions, make sure that you are emailing me, sending me a message on Jupiter, or sending me a text message via Google Voice. Okay, bye until next time.